The Phoenix Suns, are they a cautionary tale for the Sacramento Kings? Here's why I asked Jason Rose. I was looking at them. And they were 19-63, and then they got that was the year they got DeAndre Ayton as a draft pick. Now, by the way, in the I'll play this for you in the what should we call this segment here? This new segment, broadcasters who should be drug tested. I present to you our good friend Richard Jefferson.
Phoenix had the number 1 pick the year that Luka Doncic came out. They didn't take him. He loves to play against the Suns. He's kept that in the back of his mind that they did not select him first. He ended up going 3rd to Atlanta, traded for Trae Young on draft night.
Well, let me just say this. The number 1 pick was DeAndre Ayton, a fellow Arizona Wildcat. So the jury's still out on whether or not they made the right pick here.
Is the jury still out? I think the jury came back in record time.
I think it was like the whole
jury
case.
didn't even lead their
box.
Yeah,
they're judge just like, you guys can go deliberate. The jury's like, we don't need that. Yeah. Can we get a pizza though? That'd be cool.
Actually, I think the more as time goes now, the more compelling thing, because it's always, should the Kings have taken Luka?
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Should the Suns have taken Luka? To me, should it be Luka or SGA? I mean, no one put SGA in that conversation because he went 11th, but as that draft goes along, it's not Hayton. It's not Bagley.
Hey, let's have a fun conversation that no one's going to hate. What if Vlade had taken SGA over Luka at number 2? Right?
Wildly unpopular.
Yes, insanely
at the time.
Does Vlade survive long enough to be vindicated, or is he already fired because it's not even Bagley. Bagley, people understood at the time, at least, there were some people who were like, this is a good pick. SGA, it would have been like, what?
I guess if that happened, I don't know who they trade, Fox or SGA, over time. Year 1, year 2, one of them gets traded.
I have something to amend to that, though.
Okay.
What's stronger, the SGA whistle or the Kings non-whistle?
Really good point.
Great question. SGA's he's got a piccolo. It's not just a whistle. But then the thing that sucks is and I feel hypocritical saying this because I hate James Harden, but you go back and you look, I'll go back and look at most of the SGA whistles if I think they're egregious, and I'm like, well, that is a foul. But then here's the counter to the counter. I've said this many times. Okay, but at some point, the refs have to say, yes, there are going to be fouls SGA had that work. It's the Shaquille O'Neal rule.
Yeah.
If you called a foul every single time Shaquille O'Neal was fouled, he would have shot 100 free throws a game. It's just the way. I'm not saying the Lakers had a bad whistle. I'm saying Shaq had a bad whistle. And I honestly think part of it was he was such a boring, terrible free throw shooter that somewhere there was this NBA thing where it's like, look, if you really have to call it. But otherwise, we're going to have boring 4-hour games of Shaq shooting free throws and everyone on the other team is going to foul out. Jason, they were 19-63 in 2018-2019. The Suns were. They drafted DeAndre Ayton. And then the weird things started happening at the end of the following year. Is a weird year already. It's a COVID year where they end up clinging into the bubble and then going undefeated.
Yeah, that's right.
And you're like, oh, well, there's some potential here. The next year, there was some potential, and it was realized. They go 51-21. They win. They win the West. They win, the conference or the
West.
Yeah. Well, also the Pacific. That's what I was trying to say. And then they follow that up the following year, 64-18. Now, when you I looked up their most popular starting lineups that year. And the 64-18 year, they had Chris Paul. Remember, Chris Paul 4 years ago. Chris Paul, or 3 years ago. Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikal Bridges, a very young Mikal Bridges, Jay Crowder, current King, and DeAndre Ayton.
Okay.
I think you can make an argument that on paper, if you go, okay, let's see, Paul, Booker, Bridges, Crowder, Ayton. Okay, so Booker is the same. So let's take Paul, Bridges, Crowder, Ayton. Well, now you have Bradley Beal and Kevin Durant. I feel like on paper, that's at least as talented, if not a more talented, flashy team.
Yeah.
but they're 31-37. They've gone from 64 wins, and then they started to try to add things. They dropped to 45, back up to 49 last year, and now 31-37. They'll almost certainly be below 500. And I think one of the things that I feel terrible for some of this fan base, our fan base, is that I completely understand why a lot of people are bristling, not so much as they were a couple weeks ago, but bristling at the idea that this is a bad team or this is not a good team, because you look at it and you're like, well, Malik Monk's a good player.
Mm-hmm.
Keegan's a good player. Zach LaVine's a great player. DeMar DeRozan's a great player. Domantas Sabonis should be a perennial all-star MVP candidate. Keon Ellis is really good. You start looking, Jonas Valanciunas is a great backup. Guys, they just need to mesh. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'm dying on this hill. The problem with this team, and where I think people could really do themselves a favor mentally, is if you just accept that you have loud voices in the organization that think of NBA teams like fantasy basketball teams. And that's what this is. And it's kind of like what the Suns are this year. The Suns this year, pretty good fantasy you've got some great fantasy basketball players on there. But I keep going back to the Oklahoma City lineup. You look at the Oklahoma City lineup. Obviously, they have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Jalen. They're studs, right? Chet Holmgren's fine, good. But when you look at it on paper, you're like, well, is that much better than us?
Yeah.
But it's everybody has roles that complement each other, and they have an identity. This Kings team, I don't think it's a surprise that they're falling apart. First off, it's the schedule, but also there's repetition. There's imbalance. You don't have a true point guard. You just mush together this fantasy team, and you have a really big contract that's tough to move. You've got an aging player that's probably going to want out this summer. Like, when you look at this core, Jason, because I think what happened is that the Kings made the first round and they got kind of talent. Like, hey, let's just add some talent here. But I guess the question for everybody at 1-800-920-1140, if you want to weigh in, or on the text line at 916-339-1140, as we approach the inevitable end of this season, and the end of this season, either in the play-in or the first round of the playoffs, almost certainly. Is this a core that you want to build around? Is this a core that needs to be tweaked? Or do you need to flush the toilet on this thing? And I know where I stand.
Yeah, I think it's a big question. I was thinking about this on the game on Friday. Mm-hmm. And here, I'll ask you it this way. If the Kings for 82 games started this lineup, and this was primarily their team.
Yes.
Sabonis, Keegan, LaRavia, LaVine, and Keon. So you got Sabonis and LaVine are your primary, like, offensive. Those are your best offensive players.
Right.
And those were more of the shots or offenses going through.
Sabonis and who, I'm sorry? LaVine?
Yeah. But then Keegan, LaRavia, and Keon. Just what's your guess? I mean, there's no right answer. What's your guess what that team would do over 82 games?
You mean as far as record?
Yeah. 30-something wins, maybe?
I think so, yeah. Somewhere in the mid-30s, late 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, and this group's going to get that, maybe a tad more, maybe not, maybe 40, 42, 38. So I'm taking what, DeRozan and Malik out, and whether or not they're bench players or not. But now, if you put them off your bench and you start, I feel like their best players offensively start, their best players defensively come off the bench for the most part. And again, if you mix that in some way, would that be better? I don't know. It's not none of those are championship teams. That's not my point.
No.
It's just, could you have done that and go, yeah, this group will fight enough?
Shouldn't the basic rule be you're either contending for a championship or you're building towards contention for a championship, though?
Yeah, where you can honestly feel it or see it, and you go, okay, they may not be there yet, but they're on their way. I don't feel that right now.
Well, we asked the fans over the weekend a couple of important questions. Number one, should you build around this team? Number two, what's your confidence in ownership currently being able to shepherd you there? We have the results of that. We'll continue this conversation coming up next.
On the move,